So that's what I plan to do. Let's start with demographics. It's the most predictable aspect of the future. We know for sure what the population is going to look like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, barring major disasters and that kind of thing. And so, since that's what we know, we want to spend some time looking at that. Let's start with the customer profile that you have. What is the importance of the number 93 or 93 days? The importance is that 93 days from today, the first baby boomer turned 65 years old on January 1st, 2011. Now, the first time I came up with the idea of citing that number was more than 2,000 days until January 1st, 2011. Now it's 93 days. So the countdown clock is almost over. Until that moment, we tip over into what has long been forecast, and that is the landing of the age wave on shore. Now, the age wave isn't going to land like a crashing tidal wave. It's more like a tidal surge that lasts for about 15 years. And the numbers are really dramatic. Everybody in this room knows about the age wave, knows the customers potentially are getting older, and so on and so forth. But we don't get how dramatic it is. Now, I know you come from all over the country, so the numbers will vary, the percentages will vary a little bit state by state. But we're here in the state of Washington. In the state of Washington, 12% of our population is over 65 today. So when you go out on the streets of Seattle tomorrow and you walk around, on average, 1 out of every 10 people you see should be over the age of 65. When we get to 2020, in this state, the forecast is 23% over the age of 65. And in state after state in the United States, the forecast is somewhere between 20 and 25% because of all the baby boomers beginning to tip over into that age bracket. So in your mind's eye, in fact, at your table, as you answered the question, what's my image of the future? How many of you said 20 to 25%? 1 out of every 4 or 5 people I see 10 years from now will be over 65. Let me say that again. Walk down the streets in Seattle, and 1 out of every 4 or 5 people you see will be over the age of 65. What's coming? According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 27 Floridas. So if you want to see the future, who's from Florida? Is anybody here from Florida? Okay. If you want to see the future, go to Florida. Now, Florida is 17% today. But you get a little hint of what the whole country looks like, not in the distant future, but just 10 years from now. And by 2025 and 2030, it's even more dramatic. This also is a global phenomenon. It's true in China, it's true in Japan, it's true in Australia, it's true in Western and Eastern Europe, it's true in Russia, it's true everywhere, that the fastest growing age groups are these elderly aged people, that is over 65. But it's possible to get all confused about this because in the year 2020, how old will baby boomers actually be? Baby boomers will be aged 58 to 74. And that means in terms of the things that you're interested in, every single baby boomer, every single person in the age wave could still be a very active customer of this store, right? Age 58 to 74. Now, what do we know about the outdoor activities of people in those age brackets? There's actually been a fair amount of study. It's done primarily, interestingly enough, by the Forest Service and by the federal agencies that are interested in outdoor activity. And almost every year they publish a study of use of the outdoors. Now, the biggest number that's interesting from their studies is that the end of nature has been somewhat exaggerated. Oh, not the end of environmental problems, but the end of people going out into nature. In fact, people continually go out into nature in greater numbers than ever before. Just between 2000 and 2007, we went from 208 million people in the United States having at least one outdoor experience per year to 217 million. The numbers continue to climb up. The nature of their activities change. What they do in the outdoors indeed does change, but the overall numbers continue to go up. But as people turn 65 and then go through the next decade and the following decade, and in the US today, if you reach 65 and you're relatively healthy, on average, you're going to live another 20 years minimum. So you've got a couple of decades there to play with, at least. What happens is that if you look across the whole range of outdoor activities, the amount of participation in outdoor activity falls by about 50% per decade. So between ages 65 and 75, my participation in outdoor activities will decline by 50% compared to between 55 and 65, and then fall by another 50% between 75 and 85 until it really is, by then you're about 100% less and you're doing very little in outdoor activities by the time you're 85. That makes sense. But because baby boomers will be relatively young in 2020 and still even not that old in 2025, they're a very rich gold mine of potential customers if you pay attention to the things they're interested in. Now, what do they do in the outdoors? Well, what falls, of course, most dramatically are the most physically challenging kinds of activities: backpacking, climbing, snow skiing, rock climbing, swimming, and so on. What increases? What increases are walking, visiting nature, photographing nature, visiting park sites, picnicking, urban kinds of activities, and so on. All kinds of physical activity, in many cases, actually increases, but the nature of the activity changes. Recently, the state of Oregon did a study of trying to forecast for their own park and recreation systems and so on what the senior citizens, in quotes, are going to be doing. And they found an interesting number, and I don't know whether this is really true, but one of the interesting things is if you look at the U.S. Forest Service or other kinds of studies of behavior of people over age 65 in the outdoors, one of the things we have to keep in mind is this question: will baby boomers behave in the same way as people over 65 have traditionally? It may be true, it may not be true. Some of us, only a few of you in this room, but a few of you are not that far from those years. How do you plan to behave? In Oregon, when they surveyed people who were approaching age 65 and asked them, 43% said they expect to spend more time in the outdoors after age 65 than before. And only 14% said they expect to spend less time in the outdoors. But at the same time, they expected their mix of outdoor activities to change. Oregon has seen, in the same study, they reported that in the last few years, they've seen among people over age 65 a 400% increase in snowshoeing. Of course, the numbers at the beginning might have been fairly small, but a 400% increase in snowshoeing, a 270% increase in cross-country skiing, a 220% increase in yurt or cabin camping, which creates a problem in the United States because in all our wilderness areas you're not allowed to have yurts. If you could wave a magic wand over the U.S. wilderness system, change the rules a little bit, and set up some yurt-to-yurt camping, you'd see a whole lot of people over age 65 hiking in wilderness areas. That won't do it today, but I don't expect that to change, but that would change if we could adopt that kind of a European model. So that's a little bit about senior citizens. What else is happening demographically? Well, population is getting younger, it's getting more diverse. And then in your product categories, you might see a little bit more in terms of women coming in as customers. Let's talk about young people just briefly. Young people, there's two interesting generations, Generation X and the millennial generation which followed. The millennial generation is considered to have started by most measures around 1980 and then gone until the year 2000. So millennial generation, oldest of them are now 25, 26. They're the employees in your store, in your stores, they're primary customers, and so on. But the younger generation of them, in particular, are characteristic of a great label for the millennial generation, which I love, which is they are the first digital native generation. So, because if you're born in 1980, you were the first generation to be born since computers, really. If you think IBM's PC 1981, yeah, there were Apple computers around, Macintosh 1984, and so on. So the first generation to really grow up with computers, not grow into the use of computers, but to grow up with them from the time they were little kids. And the back half of the millennial generation and the new generation, which is now 10 years old, which is following that one, really immersed in technology. Now, how many here were born since 1980? We got 1, 2, I see a couple of hands, 3, so 4, okay, so there's some digital natives. Everybody else in the room is a digital immigrant, right? So, and many of them, even the person in charge of IT might not have grown up working with computers in kindergarten, but they're very skilled with it now. And all of us are relatively skilled with information technology. But for us, it is constantly new. Imagine the psychological difference between being given an iPad when you're 1 year old and looking at an iPad now as a 50-year-old or a 40-year-old or even a 35-year-old and saying, wow, that's amazing. But if you're given the thing when you're 1 year old and then you're given something else when you're 35, you think, what's the big deal? It's always been like this. What's the biggest difference between somebody who is a digital native and somebody like me? To a digital native, the phrase, I'm going to go online, becomes less and less meaningful. In fact, by 2020, I think that will be a completely obsolete phrase, the concept of being either online or offline. There will only be life. And they will be so intertwined, as they almost nearly are today, that it would be sort of a nonsensical idea to go online and to go back offline. You would just be there all the time. The other thing about the young generation, of course, in the US is that it's very, very large. It's bigger than the baby boom. The millennial generation is bigger numerically than the baby boom. It's a smaller percentage of the overall larger national population, so it has a little bit less cultural impact, I think. And yet, numerically, it's huge. And the generation which follows it is likely to be even larger because of natural population growth and immigration population growth in the US. So that's a very big group. One of the misnomers that one of the assumptions about the millennial generation or the digital natives is as follows. Because they are so immersed in digital technology, and because they live more and more in urbanized areas, they will have less and less interest in outdoor activities. Outdoor activities will be replaced by all these other things, which in fact Sally intimated. But so far, I think that's an assumption which can be questioned. It has to be very carefully tracked over the next few years, I think. But I think it's a challengeable assumption that just because they are immersed in technology, they will have no interest in the outdoors, whether that's the near outdoors and within a city, let's say, or the true wilderness outdoors out in the wilderness areas. Both of them are of interest, and according to the U.S. Forest Service studies, again, they're finding use of the even extent outdoors by the younger generation to be greater than they anticipated. If you look at the literature from the National Park Services and so on in the 1990s, they all assumed that by now, nobody young would be going into the wilderness areas anymore. That it would be completely dead. And it's fascinating to go back and look at their forecasts from 1992, 1994, and so on, and the numbers haven't borne that out. So I myself am kind of skeptical, particularly if we have companies that are enabling outdoor activities and encouraging outdoor activities. What else is happening demographically? We should say a word about diversity in the population. A couple of years ago, I had a chance to speak to the Ski Industry Association, that is the Ski Apparel and Equipment Manufacturers Association. And they were concerned, and rightly so, about the increasing diversity in the U.S. population, so much so that by the year 2042 is the year that the Census Bureau says we will tip over to the Caucasian population being the minority population in the U.S. and the non-white population being the majority of the population in the U.S. in 2042. What do we know? Well, what do we know about this management team in the room? We know it's not diverse enough yet. Well, what do we know about the diversity of your customers? We know it's not diverse enough yet if you're really going to tap into what the actual U.S. population looks like. What else do we know about? There's been a lot of study in the last few years of the minority population, particularly Hispanic population, and what will their potential use of outdoor activities be. What you find is that their use of outdoor activities is all classically defined in all the different activities that we think of is at least 50% less than the rest of the population. And in some activities like downhill snow skiing, it's dramatically less, almost off the charts less. And so then the question is, for me, and as I challenge the snow sports industry, to think, well, how can we introduce these activities to a population who didn't really grow up in them in quite the same way? But if you look at the activities they're interested in, and they actually track very well with those that are of interest to people over age 65. They're interested in walking, they're interested in visiting nature, in photographing nature, in seeing nature, in picnicking and things like that, and not so much in the more vigorous outdoor activities, although all those early things can be, it seems to me, a kind of entree into that if we really thought about how to tap into that. That's going to be a big challenge. And I don't know, and it may be a bigger challenge than really wrestling with the age differences in the population, is how do you respond to this greatly diverse U.S. population, which only becomes more diverse as we go through. And then there's a little trend that's reflected only in anecdotal evidence, but I'm told, and I certainly see when I'm out on trails, more and more single women or groups of single women, or groups of women, shall we say, backpacking in the outdoors and doing high-level outdoor activities together. And I don't know what you see in your stores and whether you have numbers on that, but it seems to me that is a coming trend when I was starting off in my true outdoor activity phase in the 1970s, it was a very male-dominated world. And I think that has changed quite dramatically, and I suspect it will continue to change as we go forward. So, demographically, a whole lot of things going on, and it is the most anticipatable part of the future, but I am curious about how values might change as these generations age, and it may not track exactly with historical evidence.